Mark Henson, once a respected ex-cop and devoted husband, became the monster no one saw coming the night he walked in on his wife Rachel and her sister Emily. And what he did next turned their quiet suburban home into a scene of unthinkable horror. Mark Henson had always been the kind of man people respected. In Crestwood, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood surrounded by trimmed lawns and wide sidewalks, he was seen as the perfect example of discipline and order. For over 15 years, Mark had served as a police officer, gaining a reputation for his sharp instincts and calm under pressure. When he retired early due to a back injury sustained during a car chase, many in the department said he had earned his peace. He bought a modest two-story house on Willow Street with his wife, Rachel, and began running a small private security company from home. To outsiders, it seemed like a peaceful new chapter in a hard-working man's life. Rachel was everything Mark wasn't: gentle, warm, and kind. She worked part-time at a local flower shop and spent the rest of her time volunteering at the community center. Everyone loved her easy smile and soft voice. Together, they seemed unbreakable, the kind of couple people admired from afar. But behind the smiles and quiet dinners, tension was growing inside their home. Mark had changed since leaving the police force. Without the uniform and authority that once defined him, he felt aimless. His new business struggled to stay afloat, and the long, empty hours at home began to eat away at him. He started to fixate on Rachel's every move. He questioned her phone calls, grew suspicious when she came home late, and accused her of keeping secrets. At first, Rachel brushed it off as stress from his new routine, but as the months passed, she began to feel trapped in her own house. The man she once adored now watched her every step with cold, analyzing eyes. His tone grew sharp, his patience thin, and arguments became frequent over the smallest things. When Rachel's younger sister, Emily, came to stay with them, the mood in the house shifted even more. Emily was in her 20s, carefree and recovering from a painful breakup. She brought a burst of energy that the Henson household hadn't felt in years. She laughed loudly, played music, and tried to lift Rachel's spirits. But to Mark, her presence was an unwelcome intrusion. He didn't like how Rachel seemed more relaxed and happy when Emily was around. He noticed their long conversations, the secret smiles they exchanged, and the way Rachel began spending less time with him. What should have been a temporary visit began to feel like a threat to his authority. The more Mark observed, the more suspicious he became. He told himself he was being rational, that he could sense something wasn't right, but what was really growing inside him was paranoia. He installed cameras around the house under the excuse of security upgrades, though Rachel never asked for them. He started checking Emily's social media and reading Rachel's messages when she wasn't looking. Every small detail he found fed his anger further. In his mind, Mark wasn't losing control, he was protecting his home, but in reality he was unraveling. The once respected officer had become a man consumed by obsession and jealousy, haunted by the idea that the people closest to him were betraying his trust. And as his suspicions deepened, the calm suburban home on Willow Street was slowly turning into a pressure cooker of secrets, tension, and silent resentment. No one could have imagined then that this growing storm would end in blood. The night everything changed began like any other Saturday in Crestwood, calm and uneventful. The streetlights glowed softly, the neighborhood dogs barked in the distance, and most homes had already gone dark for the night. Mark had spent the evening at a local bar with two former colleagues from the police department. They drank, reminisced about old cases, and complained about how life after the force felt empty. By the time Mark left, the bitterness he carried inside him had only deepened. The alcohol burned his throat, but it couldn't numb the growing suspicion festering in his mind. He drove home slowly, headlights cutting through the empty streets, replaying every moment of tension between him and Rachel over the past few weeks. When he pulled into the driveway just after midnight, everything seemed quiet. Rachel's car was parked neatly in the garage, and the lights in the living room were off. He expected to find her asleep, maybe, watching television in their bedroom, but as soon as he stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, still, almost like the house was holding its breath. He tossed his keys onto the counter and noticed the faint hum of a lamp coming from down the hallway. It was the guest room, Emily's room. He moved closer, each step echoing in his head like a warning he refused to hear. The door was half open, and from the narrow gap between the frame he could see faint movement. Then came the sound, soft whispers, low laughter, and something else, something unmistakable. Mark froze, his mind struggling to make sense of what his ears were telling him. He pushed the door open wider, and what he saw ripped through the last piece of control he had. Rachel and Emily were in bed together. The dim light painted them in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. For a second, time stopped. The shock hit him first, followed by disbelief so strong it made his body tremble. Then came the fury, a deep, primal rage that burned through his chest like fire. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was humiliation, confusion, and heartbreak, all colliding in one unbearable moment. His wife, the woman he had devoted his life to, and her sister, the guest under his roof, had shattered everything he thought he knew. Mark turned away, pacing back and forth, his breathing erratic. He felt dizzy, his vision narrowing, the alcohol amplifying every emotion. He stormed into the garage and grabbed the one thing that had always given him a sense of power, his old service pistol. He loaded it with shaking hands, his thoughts blurring into a storm of anger and disbelief. When he walked back into the house, his mind was no longer rational. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Neighbors later reported hearing loud shouting, followed by 2 deafening gunshots, then silence. The sound carried down the street, jolting people awake. By the time the police arrived, the once peaceful Henson home had turned into a scene of horror. Rachel and Emily were lifeless, lying side by side on the bed. Mark sat motionless in the living room, the gun resting on the coffee table. His eyes were blank, expression unreadable, as if he was staring through the walls into nothingness. The man who had once served the law had now broken it in the most brutal way imaginable, and nothing in Crestwood would ever be the same again. The news of the double homicide spread through Crestwood before sunrise, shattering the quiet normalcy of the neighborhood. Police cars lined Willow Street, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness as officers swarmed the Henson property. The scene inside was gruesome and silent. 2 bodies lay in the guest room, covered with white sheets, while the man responsible, former officer Mark Henson, sat calmly on the living room couch, hands cuffed, head bowed. He didn't resist arrest, didn't argue, didn't utter a single word. To the officers who once worked beside him, it was a haunting sight. Mark, the man they used to call Steady Hands, now looked hollow, as if the life had already drained out of him. Detectives began piecing together what had happened. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle, no indication of an intruder. The entire event seemed to have taken place in a matter of minutes. A loaded pistol was found on the coffee table where Mark had been sitting, and his fingerprints covered the weapon. Gunshot residue stained his hands and sleeves. In the corner of the room, Rachel's phone lay on the floor, screen cracked, still glowing faintly from a missed call. It appeared that she or Emily had tried to reach for it in the final seconds before the shots were fired. The lead investigator, Detective Laura Reeves, was one of the first on the scene. She had worked with Mark years before, when he was still with the department. Seeing him like this, expressionless, silent, and detached, was deeply unsettling. She knew the signs of rage and remorse, but Mark displayed neither. It was as if he had flipped a switch inside his mind and turned off everything human. When officers asked him to explain what happened, he simply stared at the wall and said nothing. Over the next few days, investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members. Almost everyone described the Hensons as a respectable couple, though a few mentioned that things had seemed tense lately. One neighbor recalled hearing Mark yelling late at night, accusing Rachel of lying to him about something. Another remembered Emily leaving the house in tears a week before the murders, only to return the next day. These fragments of information painted a picture of a household under quiet strain, one where resentment and suspicion had been simmering for months. As evidence piled up, the motive began to take shape. Rachel's phone was examined, revealing text messages between her and Emily that hinted at a relationship deeper than sisterly affection. Investigators concluded that Mark must have discovered them together that night, snapping in a moment of uncontrollable fury. To the public, the story was shocking. A decorated officer, a man once dedicated to justice, had turned into a killer overnight. But to those who looked closer, the breakdown seemed gradual. A slow unraveling of a man who couldn't accept losing control over his life. In the days that followed, Mark was officially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His mugshot appeared on every news channel, his expression blank and unreadable. People who had once called him a hero now struggled to comprehend how someone so disciplined could commit such a brutal act. Crestwood, the town that rarely made headlines, became the center of national attention. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, neighbors whispered in hushed tones, and the once peaceful street where the Hensons lived became a symbol of tragedy. What no one could yet explain was whether Mark's crime was a split-second reaction or the final collapse of a mind that had been breaking for a long time. As the investigation deepened, the picture of what led to that violent night began to form more clearly, though every new discovery only added layers of tragedy. Detectives analyzed Rachel's phone and computer, uncovering months of private conversations between her and Emily. The messages revealed a gradual emotional connection that developed after Emily's breakup. Rachel had been there for her sister, comforting her through sleepless nights, offering advice, and spending long hours together while Mark buried himself in work and resentment. What began as compassion turned into something more intimate, something both women seemed to struggle to understand. They planned to keep it secret until Emily could move out, fearing how Mark might react if he ever found out. Investigators also discovered that Mark's security business was failing. He had taken out several high-interest loans to keep it running, and debt collectors were already contacting him. Friends told police that Mark often complained about feeling disrespected and forgotten since leaving the force. He believed everyone had moved on without him, and that Rachel no longer admired him the way she once did. The combination of financial pressure, lost pride, and suspicion toward his wife created a perfect storm inside his mind. Forensic psychologists were later brought in to evaluate him. They described Mark as a man who had built his entire identity around control. Control over his environment, his relationships, and his emotions. Retirement stripped him of that structure, leaving him adrift and insecure. When he caught Rachel and Emily together, it wasn't just infidelity in his eyes. It was a complete collapse of the world he thought he commanded. The betrayal came not from strangers, but from the 2 people he trusted most. And in that instant, his sense of logic and restraint snapped. But there was another discovery that raised eyebrows. On Mark's laptop, detectives found a folder labeled Evidence, containing photos and notes he had taken of Rachel and Emily in the weeks leading up to the murders. There were screenshots of text messages, recordings of phone calls, and even footage from hidden cameras he had installed around the house. He had been spying on them for weeks, compiling what he believed was proof of deceit. These findings painted a chilling portrait of a man who had been building toward violence long before that night. The prosecution seized on this evidence to argue that the killings were not a spontaneous act of passion, but premeditated murder. Mark's defense team countered that he had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by emotional shock and psychological instability. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial, with reporters filling the front rows and townspeople lining up outside for a glimpse of the man who had once been their protector. As the testimonies unfolded, Rachel and Emily's story emerged with painful clarity. a secret relationship born from vulnerability, hidden out of fear, and destroyed by the one man who could not bear to lose control. Every new piece of evidence revealed how quickly trust can become obsession, and love can twist into possession. The more the jury heard, the more they understood that this was not just a crime of rage. It was the final act in a slow, tragic unraveling of a man who could not accept the truth. When the trial reached its conclusion, the courtroom was filled with a tense and expectant silence. Weeks of testimony, photographs, and emotional statements had built a case that felt both horrifying and heartbreaking. The jury had seen everything. The surveillance footage Mark had secretly taken of his own family, the text messages between Rachel and Emily that revealed their struggle to hide their relationship, and the grim crime scene photos that captured the aftermath of that night. Every piece of evidence painted a portrait of a man who had lost control, long before he ever pulled the trigger. The prosecution argued that Mark's actions were deliberate. They said he had been consumed by jealousy, had planned the confrontation, and had used his police training to carry out the killings in a calculated manner. The defense countered that Mark was mentally unstable, claiming that his years on the force had left him emotionally scarred, and that the shock of what he witnessed pushed him into a temporary breakdown. They described him as a broken man, one who acted not out of hatred, but out of devastation and confusion. When the jury returned after 2 days of deliberation, every eye in the room was fixed on them. The verdict was clear and final. Mark Henson was guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He did not react. His expression remained blank, his hands clasped in front of him as the judge pronounced a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a man who had once worn a badge and sworn to protect others, it was a cruel and fitting irony. The town of Crestwood struggled to move on. The house on Willow Street sat empty for months before it was sold, its windows boarded and its garden overgrown. Neighbors avoided walking past it as if the memories of what happened there lingered in the air. Rachel and Emily were buried beside each other in the town cemetery, their graves marked by simple white headstones. On the anniversaries of their deaths, small bouquets would appear, left by people who had never known them but felt the tragedy deeply. In prison, Mark became a ghost of himself. Guards described him as quiet, polite, and withdrawn. He rarely spoke to anyone, never accepted visitors, and spent most of his time writing in a small notebook that he kept hidden under his mattress. No one knew what he wrote: letters of apology, confessions, or perhaps just endless reflections on what he had done. Some inmates said he often stared at the wall for hours, murmuring Rachel's name under his breath. Others believed he felt no remorse at all, only bitterness that his life had ended behind bars. Years later, journalists revisited the case in documentaries and articles, calling it one of the most disturbing family tragedies in the state's history. Experts described it as a perfect storm of psychological collapse, obsession, and betrayal. But to those who lived through it, the neighbors, the friends, the officers who had once worked beside Mark, it was more than a story. It was a reminder of how quickly a life can unravel when love turns to control and trust turns to fear. The Henson case became a symbol of how darkness can exist even behind the most ordinary front doors, waiting for one night to destroy everything.